Welcome back to our Explainer series. We're picking right up where we left off. It's 1958. We find a young Dhirubhai Ambani stepping off a boat from Aden, returning to India with pretty limited savings, and stepping straight into the gritty reality of the country's commercial heart. He is no longer just a clerk melting down silver reals. He is finally ready to strike out on his own. So let's dive into this and see exactly how a master trader begins to build an absolute empire.
Now, you might think the logical move for a guy with limited savings would be to play it safe. And he almost did. Initially, Dhirubhai considered setting up a safe, standard automobile spare parts dealership in Rajkot, a provincial city back in his native region. But a lawyer friend pulled him aside and basically said, "Look, this is a mundane business. There's a ceiling on what you can do here." And Dhirubhai, well, he didn't want safe. He wanted scale. He realized that to truly make his mark, he had to ignore the provincial comforts and dive headfirst into the chaotic, high-stakes markets of Bombay. Because Bombay, that was where the real game was played.
Of course, to play that Bombay game, you need capital. So he partnered up with his second cousin, Chambaklal Damani, who had actually also been working over in Aden. Damani's father, who was a retired merchant, provided the seed money. It was exactly 100,000 rupees. And with that very specific fund, the two men founded the Reliance Commercial Corporation.
Now, the name Reliance Commercial Corporation sounds incredibly grand, right? Well, the physical reality was anything but. The entire operation was run out of a 350-square-foot room in the crowded Masjid Bandar district of Bombay. His personal life was just as modest, by the way. He and his growing family were living in crowded shared chal housing. But going back to that office, it was unbelievably cramped. We're talking one telephone, one table, and 3 chairs. If the two partners and their 2 newly hired employees were all in the room at the same time, someone literally had to stand.
But from that tiny, cramped room, they got to work. At first, they stuck to what they knew. They started trading familiar goods. They exported spices, like betel nut, to their old contacts in the Aden souks, and they shipped traditional cotton and nylon textiles out to Ethiopia and Kenya. But Dhirubhai and his team were sharp. They quickly recognized a much bigger opportunity right in their own backyard. And that was the frenetic, incredibly profitable, Gujarati-dominated synthetic yarn market at Paidoni in Bombay.
Section 1. The Paidoni Yarn Market. Mastering Bureaucracy.
To get into this market, Dhirubhai had to completely master India's notoriously complex textile bureaucracy. You see, India at the time was literally starved for artificial fibers, and the government strictly controlled all imports. But Dhirubhai managed to crack the code. The government had this program where they granted import licenses, they called them replenishment or reps licenses, to registered exporters of textiles. It worked like a mechanical loop. Step 1, you export traditional Indian textiles out of the country. Step 2, you get rewarded with these highly restricted reps licenses. Step 3, you use those exact licenses to import synthetic yarn back into India where there was just a massive, desperate demand for it. Dhirubhai essentially reverse-engineered this entire bureaucratic machine.
And he figured something out very quickly. Those REPS licenses, they were as good as pure cash. So Dhirubhai started paying higher premiums than literally any other trader in the market just to buy up these licenses from other exporters. Now, the margins on the physical trade of the yarn itself were actually pretty tiny. But because he was so aggressively hoarding these licenses, he essentially began dominating the entire market. He was gaining this unprecedented control over the very tap of yarn supply into India.
Section 2. Surviving the crises. Navigating volatility.
But when you control the tap, you naturally become a target. Fast forward to the mid-1960s, and textile prices are absolutely soaring. This led the government to heavily crack down on market speculation. They outright banned forward trading, and suddenly, roughly a dozen prominent traders were arrested and thrown into the Picket Road police station. The entire market was in a state of sheer despair. Then, late that evening, Dhirubhai walks into the police station like he owns the place. He's shouting warm greetings to the senior officers, handing out snacks, just smiling ear to ear. And within an hour, the complaints were suddenly shelved and every single trader was released. A peer of his later described this almost magical, totally unexplained intervention with just 2 words: the usual, India.
But an even bigger existential threat hit the market in 1967. Bombay Customs, acting on reports that traders were misusing licenses, suddenly impounded massive incoming cargoes of artificial fibers. We are talking about roughly 40 million rupees worth of yarn just seized. The fallout was immediate. Trailers started defaulting on loans, and the entire market was completely paralyzed. Dhirubhai fought this for 6 agonizing months, making endless, exhausting trips to Delhi to meet with the finance minister. And then the crisis ended just as suddenly as it had begun. An appeals tribunal under a Justice Oberoi held a single one-day hearing and completely ruled in favor of the importers. Everything was released. To this day, market insiders widely allege that this miraculous, sudden judicial resolution was entirely engineered behind the scenes by Dhirubhai himself.
Section 3. Catching live serpents, an ideological break.
Surviving these massive back-to-back crises really forced a breaking point inside the company. You have to remember, his partner, Chambaklal Damani, was naturally cautious and risk-averse. The near insolvency of that 1967 crisis absolutely terrified him. But Dhirubhai, he was aggressive. He had this big, boisterous personality, loved practical jokes, and he absolutely thrived on making high-risk plays. The final rupture between the two happened when Reliance built up this massive stockpile of yarn. Damani panicked. He demanded they reduce their exposure before the market collapsed. So what did Dhirubhai do? He secretly sold the entire stockpile to himself. Just a few weeks later, the price shot up, and Dhirubhai personally made an absolute fortune. He did actually offer to share the profit with Damani, but he accompanied it with a very cold warning. Never intervene in the business again if you don't understand it. Needless to say, the trust between them was completely shattered.
For an ordinary, cautious trader like Damani, trying to co-pilot a business with Dhirubhai was just way too terrifying. It all boils down to how a former colleague from their Aden days perfectly described his risk appetite. He said, his business is catching live serpents.
So they had to separate. It was inevitable. Dhirubhai and his brothers paid exactly 600,000 rupees to buy Damani completely out of Reliance. With absolute, unquestioned control finally secured, Dhirubhai moved the company out of that tiny Masjid Bandar room and into a significantly larger office in the courthouse building over at Dobita Law.
Section 4. The Naroda factory. Into manufacturing. Having completely mastered the trading game, Dhirubhai was ready for the next massive leap, manufacturing. He chose an industrial estate in Naroda, Gujarat, primarily because the land prices were much cheaper. And the beginnings here were just incredibly modest. They started with exactly 4 knitting machines. And his workforce? Well, he actually recruited his loyal former colleagues all the way from Aden. Now keep in mind, none of these guys had zero experience in textiles. It was a really gritty period of intense trial and error. They even got hit by a devastating forged payment scam early on. But Dhirubhai? He just absorbed the loss and kept pushing. They survived on this tight-knit, family-like atmosphere, relentless 14-hour workdays, and these totally grueling 6 a.m. phone calls from Dhirubhai demanding progress updates.
To really understand his management style, you have to hear this story. He just flat out refused to accept roadblocks. Once, the factory urgently needed these imported German spare parts for the machines at Naroda, but there were absolutely no transport trucks available in Bombay to run the parts up to Ahmedabad. Anyone else would have waited, not Dhirubhai. He simply went out and bought 2 trucks outright, one to carry the parts and one just as a backup, sent them to the factory, and then immediately sold both trucks the second they arrived. He literally wouldn't let anything stop production.
Section 5. The birth of Vimal, a mass-market brand.
So how did this scrappy little operation become a behemoth? Let's put this insane growth into perspective. In 1967, which was Naroda's first full year in operation, they had about 20 staff members and did 9 million rupees in sales. Fast forward exactly 10 years to 1977, they now had 5,000 staff members and pulled in a staggering 680 million rupees in sales. How on earth did he grow it that fast? It's simple. Dhirubhai and his family absolutely refused to take any dividends. They reinvested every single rupee of profit right back into the business, buying more machines and relentlessly expanding their capacity.
But producing all that fabric is only half the battle, right? To sell that massive capacity, he needed a real brand. So he named it Vimal after his nephew. And his marketing strategy here was pure genius. He used a somewhat snobbish slogan, only Vimal, and he hosted these incredibly lavish fashion shows in top-tier luxury hotels. He deliberately created this premium high-class aura to sell polyester, which, let's be honest, was essentially a product made for the less wealthy mass-market sectors. There was just one massive roadblock. The traditional wholesalers and shopkeepers actually rejected the new brand at first. They wouldn't stock it. So Dhirubhai aggressively bypassed them entirely. He created his own nationwide network of franchise Vimal shops. We're talking a massive 400 exclusive retail outlets. He literally controlled the product from the moment it left the factory floor all the way directly to the consumer. So let's take a step back and wrap this up. Dhirubhai has learned how to trade, he has survived existential, paralyzing market crises, and he has successfully built a massive manufacturing operation from scratch, establishing a highly recognized national brand. But the crazy thing is, he's just getting started. Think about it. Dhirubhai had conquered the souks of Aden, the ruthless markets of Bombay, and the factory floors of Gujarat. But what happens when a master trader decides he doesn't just want to participate in the system anymore? He wants to own the entire system. Well, that is exactly what we are going to explore in our next explainer. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you then.